Hello Class 4, we're going to have the next bit of Chapter 2 of Stig of the Dump, and we're going to start from where we left off yesterday. He set off running, back to the garden. Presents for Stig. When he visited people this time of year, you always brought something from the garden. Tomatoes you couldn't bottle, or apples you hadn't room to store. He looked round the big old apple tree for windfalls. There were some big ones, difficult to manage without a basket, but he stuffed them into his shirt, making sure there weren't any wasps in them first. What else? He saw a line of carrots, his favourite fruit. He was allowed to pull up carrots. They were good for his teeth. So he heaved up a few good-sized ones and rubbed the earth off with his fingers. Then he had an idea and ran to the tool shed where he found a ball of garden string. It was all right just to borrow it. Back he ran again, across the garden, over the fence, across the paddock, over into the copse, and through the brambles and dead leaves to the edge of the pit. He sat comfortably on the trunk of the tree that curved out over the pit like the neck of a camel, and looked carefully again at what he could see. There was the broken edge of the cliff. There were the trailing creepers. There at the bottom were the scattered lumps of chalk that had come down with him. And now that he was really looking at it, he could see a piece of something else new. Well, not exactly new. Nothing in the dump was new. But it looked as if it had been put there not long before it wasn't covered, because it wasn't covered with moss like the things that had been there for a long time. And he could see, at one side of this pile of branches, and things that were Stig's lean-to roof, a faint path in the bottom of the pit that led to the front of the den. He found the end of the ball of string and tied the bunch of carrots to it. Then he began to pay out the string, with the carrots dangling on the end, towards the bottom of the pit. He hoped that it was long enough. There always seemed to be miles of string in a ball, but it dwindled and dwindled as he lowered the carrots down, until he was afraid that it wouldn't reach the bottom. Bother! A cobble, a regular spider's nest of tangled string appeared, and he had to stop to uncobble it. At last, with a few feet in hand, the carrots were swinging on a level with Stig's front door. Barney's seat was not quite above it, so he had to get the carrots swinging to and fro, all that way beneath him, until they were actually knocking at the door like 5 pink fingers. Barney was bubbling so much with laughter inside him at the trick he was playing on Stig that he forgot to be dizzy. "Stig!" he called down the pit. "Morning, Stig! I'm knocking at your front door." And suddenly, out from a stack of branches appeared the tousled head of Stig, and stayed there wagging to and fro, following the swinging carrots like a cat watching a pendulum. Barney nearly fell off the tree with laughing. "Hello, Stig," he called. "Good morning. I'm Barney. You remember? How are you?" Stig looked up, and for a moment Barney felt quite frightened at the ferocious scowl on his face, and was glad to be high up out of his reach. Should he have played a trick on Stig? Perhaps he didn't have what the grown-ups called a sense of humour. Did Stigs have sense of humours? But when Stig made out who it was sitting above him, his face suddenly changed. His big white teeth showed in a broad grin. He waved both his arms over his head, and he jumped about in the bottom of the pit to show how pleased he was. "Have a carrot, Stig," called Barney. "For you," he said, pointing to Stig. "To eat," he added. "Good for your teeth," he said, making biting movements. Stig leapt at the carrots as they swung past, caught them, looked at them closely, smelt them, and then put one in his mouth and crunched it. He looked up at Barney, smiling with his mouth full, to show that he liked his presents, and then made signs which clearly meant that Barney was to come down. "Well, I'm not going to jump this time," said Barney, "and this string's too thin to climb down. Going round," he said, making circling movements with his arm. He got off his perch and walked the long way round the top of the pit to the shallow end, where he'd got out the night before. It was more difficult finding his way to Stig's den along the floor of the pit than it had been finding his way out the night before. The dump looked quite different, more cheerful, with the sunlight pouring down through the golden autumn leaves and the ashen sycamore seeds twiddling down from the trees on top. But the tail of an aeroplane was only part of a farm machine, and the ship's helm was a broken cartwheel. There was the bicycle too, just a rusty frame with bits of brake hanging onto it. Never mind, he found something much more interesting, and he'd seen it and spoken to it in broad daylight. A real-life Stig, and he was going to visit him. That's if he could find his way among the giant nettles. Suddenly, there was Stig, coming to meet him, straight through a nettle patch, as if stings meant nothing to him. Barney stopped. What now? Shake hands? Rub noses? No, perhaps not. He remembered the apples he had stowed inside his shirt, took one out and held it towards Stig on the palm of his hand, as if he was trying to make friends with a horse. I hope you like the carrots, Stig, said Barney. Have an apple. Stig took the apple quite politely between his finger and his thumb, not between his teeth, as Barney somehow expected him to, and he sniffed it. Barney took out another apple for himself and bit into it. Good, he said. Delicious. Stig took a bite, seemed to like it, smiled, and they both started walking towards the den, munching their apples. Stig just blundered through the nettles, and as far as Barney could see, they stung him and raised bumps as they did on other people, but he just didn't care. Barney himself avoided the nettles as much as he could. He got stung once or twice, but decided not to make a fuss about it. Stigs don't mind stings, he thought, so he'd better not. Stig led the way to the den. Barney noticed several dumps of new white chalk near the path, and remembered the new tunnelling he had seen yesterday, and the baby's bath full of chalk. Been digging, Stig? He asked, pointing to the dumps. Stig grinned and nodded. It was gloomy and overhung at Stig's end of the pit, even on this bright day, and the den itself, now that the hole in the roof was mended, was even darker. The teapot lamp was flickering and throwing a dim light on the den and the place where Stig had been digging, but it was not very cheerful. Come to think of it, thought Barney, rabbits and things that live in holes don't have any light at all. Not much fun for them, with no windows. Couldn't he find some windows for Stig? What made it worse is that Stig had started a small fire in the den part. He must have just done it, because Barney had not noticed any smoke when he was sitting on the tree trunk. The smoke was filling the den, and there was no way out for it except to trickle through the gaps in the roof. It made Barney's eyes water, but he supposed it was just one of those things he had to put up with, like nettles. All the same, the place could do with a chimney as well as windows. He began to get used to the darkness, and he could see that the tunnel at the back of the cave went further back into the chalk than he'd noticed. The digging tools were laying around, the bedstead leg, a broken cast iron shoe scraper, and an iron bar like the one he'd seen his father use to jack the lift, used on the jack to lift the car up. Stig was reaching up to offer Barney another turnip, but Barney didn't feel like turnips so soon after breakfast. Can I help you dig, Stig? He asked. I expect you're busy anyhow. He went to the end of the tunnel and picked up a bit of the bedstead and began to attack the wall of chalk. It was not as easy as he had expected. The chalk on the inside of the hill here was firm, not crumbly as it was on the outside where the rain got to it. Barney's bashes with the awkward piece of metal only broke off smallish chips of chalk, and he was soon puffed. Stig, who had been standing watching him, took the digger from his hands and showed him how to dig out the hollow at the bottom of the chalk wall, then knocked down large chunks which came away easily because they were not held up underneath. There was soon a pile of loose chalk, and Barney picked it up with his hands and put it in the small tin bath. Then it was full. It was about as much as he could drag along the floor of the cave towards the entrance. Stig helped him, and between them they lugged the load out of the den and dumped it. But Barney noticed Stig took care to put it some way from his door. He supposed that piles of new white chalk would not let people know that something was going on. Stig let him dig next time, and he soon got the hang of cutting under and letting it tumble down from the top. Now and then they would come to a great flint embedded in the chalk, like a fossil monster with knobs and bulges, and they would have to chip round it, worry it, and loosen it like a tooth until it last came free, usually bringing down a lot of chalk with it. They worked on happily for quite a time, taking it in turns to dig and load, and now and then they would stop for a break and take a drink of water from the tin or eat a refreshing apple. and we will leave it there until tomorrow. Okay, see you tomorrow.